The studio lights were brutal, even by morning talk show standards, and they cast long, unflattering shadows across the polished table where 5 women sat like cultural sentinels, sipping coffee and preparing their next volley. The View was never known for subtlety, and today was no exception. The air was thick with anticipation, partly because the audience could smell blood, figurative for now, and partly because Mark Wahlberg, the guest of the hour, was not the kind of Hollywood figure who played nice when backed into a corner. Joy Behar had already sharpened her tone before he walked on stage, clutching her stack of notes like they were classified intel. She smiled, thin, practiced, and waited for the inevitable storm. Wahlberg entered to applause, flashing that same disarming grin he'd honed since the 90s. But behind the charm there was something sharper, more focused, a quiet fury that only those who truly knew him could see. The opening chit-chat was light, upcoming projects, fitness regimens, faith. But then Joy, ever the provocateur, pivoted with a quicksilver comment about certain actors who like to preach values while profiting from violence on screen, her gaze never leaving his face. The audience gasped, a few clapped, the rest froze. Mark blinked once, smiled wider, and leaned in. "That's interesting coming from someone who's made a career turning outrage into currency," he said, his tone like velvet wrapped around steel. Joy recoiled, not physically, but in her posture, her breath hitching just enough to register with the cameras. Whoopi Goldberg shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the trajectory. Mark continued, his voice low and lethal, not yelling, not flailing, just carving clean through the false decorum. He brought up his past, not as an apology, but as a ledger he'd paid in full. He spoke about growing up in Dorchester, about the prison stint, about redemption earned not in press releases but in silence, sweat, and community work. Then he pulled out his phone, not for drama, but for receipts. A screenshot, Joy's 2014 comment mocking veterans. A clip of her laughing, off religious people as delusional. The table turned cold. Joy's hands trembled. "We all evolve," she said weakly. But Mark wasn't done. He leaned closer. "The difference is, I don't sell my past as a punchline," he said. The audience was silent now, no clapping, just breathless suspension. Even Sonny Hostin, usually eager to jump in, sat rigid. The segment producer behind the camera gestured frantically. Wrap it, move on. But no one moved. Joy finally tried to laugh, that brittle, defensive laugh that sounded like glass cracking under pressure. "Well, I guess you've done your homework," she said. Mark didn't blink. "No, I lived mine," he said. And just like that, the momentum shifted. Not with shouting, not with slogans, but with calm, devastating clarity. The show cut to commercial, but the internet had already clipped it, captioned it, and sent it ricocheting across platforms. Mark Wahlberg hadn't just survived The View, he'd rewritten the script. And Joy Behar, queen of daytime combat, sat quietly, the steam from her coffee the only thing rising. The fallout wasn't digital, it was seismic. Within hours, the clip had crossed platforms, from X to TikTok, from Reddit to morning news, an emotional grenade tossed into America's breakfast table discourse. Everyone had an opinion, but no one could ignore it. By nightfall, hashtags like What Wahlberg Unfiltered and Joy Behar Exposed trended globally, and producers at ABC scrambled to contain what couldn't be contained. PR statements were drafted and deleted, back-channel apologies whispered. But it was too late. The internet had crowned a new cultural moment, and Mark, the accidental gladiator, stood at its center, calm as ever. The next morning, his team tried to coach him. Let it cool, don't add fuel, play it classy. But Mark knew better. This wasn't about escalation, it was about truth. And for the first time in years, he saw that people were starving for it. Not the curated PR-tested truth, but the raw kind, the kind that didn't blink under studio lights. So he showed up. Not on another talk show, not on a podcast, but at a community center in Roxbury, in front of kids who actually knew what struggle felt like. Cameras followed, yes, but the message wasn't performance. He spoke about anger, about not letting it eat you, about how platforms like The View had become temples of self-righteousness that mocked faith, mocked working-class grit, and pretended. It was all intellectual debate. The backlash came swift. Joy's defenders called it a smear, labeled Wahlberg a bully, a thug in a suit. But the more they screamed, the quieter he got, and that silence hit harder than any clapback. Then came the letter. A former staffer from the network leaked an internal memo, an older one, buried for years, showing a pattern of targeted segment scripting designed to provoke conservative-leaning guests, to manufacture viral moments for ratings. Joy's name was on it. The internet exploded again. Now it wasn't just about Mark. It was about the entire machinery of daytime discourse, the scripts beneath the smiles. Whoopi tried to pull focus back with a monologue about unity and growth, but it fell flat. Mark, meanwhile, stayed grounded. He didn't gloat. He went quiet. Let the chaos speak for itself. He took his daughter to school, walked into a diner in Lowell like nothing had changed, but the glances he got weren't starstruck anymore. They were grateful, like he'd said something the country had been choking on, but couldn't name. Joy canceled her next appearance. ABC pulled the segment from their YouTube, but it didn't matter. The truth, once released, doesn't retreat. It just waits. And Mark Wahlberg, without intending to, had become its voice. Not polished, not perfect, but impossible to ignore. But narratives don't just unravel quietly in today's world. They ignite, and then they consume. A week after the segment, Mark found himself not just in the public eye, but in the crosshairs of a system trying to save its image. Emails leaked. Anonymous tips surfaced. Rumors of a hidden past began swirling. Not new facts, but old ones, recycled with venom, repackaged to discredit him. The media began framing a new angle. Not the man who stood his ground, but the man with unresolved anger, a relic of toxic masculinity. Think pieces flooded in. Panels debated whether his calm confrontation was bravery or intimidation. But Mark didn't respond, not because he was defeated, but because he'd already said what mattered. Instead, his silence became a mirror. People started looking at the bigger picture. How sanitized conversations had become, how dissent was framed as aggression, how realness was punished while scripted outrage was rewarded. The silence forced reflection. Ratings for The View dipped. Clips of Mark's moment continued to rise, not just in views but in commentary, people sharing how it reminded them of confrontations they'd avoided, truths they'd swallowed. Meanwhile, Joy, cloistered in damage control, finally agreed to an off-camera interview, an attempt to reframe, to control the story. But the interviewer pressed hard, and under pressure, Joy admitted something that changed everything. "I knew it was scripted," she said, hands shaking. "We were told to trigger him." The admission spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was proof. The show went on hiatus. Executives shuffled out with quiet severance. Mark, for his part, stayed away from screens. He went back to building, real things, with wood and stone and time. A church, renovation, a youth boxing program, things that didn't trend but mattered. People tried to pull him back into the arena, offered book deals, documentaries. He declined them all, because the point had never been fame. It was clarity. And when, months later, a journalist finally caught up to him outside a Boston church and asked if he had any regrets, Mark simply smiled. "I didn't start that fire," he said. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't burning."